The Galactic Academy of Advanced Sciences floated in the void between three star systems, its crystalline spires catching the light of distant suns. For over 2,000 years, it had been the most prestigious institution in known space, where the brightest minds from hundreds of species came to learn the deepest secrets of the universe. The acceptance rate was less than 1%. Getting in meant you were among the elite of the elite. Commander Zethkar of the Valerian Empire stood at the observation deck of the Academy's central tower, his four arms crossed behind his back as he watched the latest batch of students disembark from their transport ships. His species had ruled the galaxy for 8 centuries, their military might and technological superiority unquestioned. The Valorians had built this academy, and they made sure everyone knew it. "Another year of promising young minds," said Professor Valterra, the Academy's dean. She was a Kytherian, her translucent blue skin shimmering as data streams flowed beneath it like living tattoos. The Kytherians were the galaxy's foremost experts in quantum mathematics and dimensional physics. Though I notice we have an unusual addition this cycle. Zethkar's mandibles clicked with irritation. The human. Yes, Elena Rodriguez from the Sol System. Quite remarkable test scores, actually. She outperformed candidates from species with natural telepathic abilities on the psionic reasoning sections. Impossible. Humans have been spacefaring for what, barely 3 centuries? They're still using chemical rockets to reach their outer planets. Their entire civilization would fit in one of our minor colonies. Zethkar's voice carried the dismissive tone most galactic citizens used when discussing humanity. Nevertheless, her scores were verified multiple times. The testing committee was quite thorough. Valterra's data streams pulsed with what might have been amusement. Perhaps we should give her a chance before writing her off. Down in the Academy's main courtyard, Elena Rodriguez stepped off the transport ramp and took her first breath of recycled station air. She was 22 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with quiet intensity. Her clothes were simple and practical compared to the elaborate robes and environmental suits worn by her fellow students. She had dreamed of this moment since she was 12 years old, when humanity had first made contact with the greater galactic community. While most humans were still adjusting to the revelation that they weren't alone in the universe, Elena had thrown herself into studying every scrap of information about galactic civilization she could find. "Look at that primitive," sneered a voice behind her. Elena turned to see a tall, reptilian figure with iridescent scales and too many teeth. "I can't believe they're letting mammals from the outer rim attend the academy now." The speaker was clearly from one of the core worlds, probably draconian nobility based on the golden neural crown adorning his head. Several other students gathered around him, representing a dozen different species, but united in their obvious disdain. "I heard humans still kill each other over which invisible sky god they worship," added a crystalline being whose voice chimed like breaking glass. How did something so backwards even discover space travel? Elena felt her cheeks burn, but she kept walking. She had expected this. Humanity was still seen as a curiosity at best, a potential threat at worst by the established galactic powers. Earth was barely more than a galactic footnote, mentioned mainly for its unusual biodiversity and the surprising aggression of its dominant species. Her dormitory assignment led her through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever, lined with trophies and monuments celebrating the greatest discoveries in galactic history. The walls themselves were made from quantum-stabilized matter that displayed rotating star charts and mathematical formulas that hurt to look at directly. Elena's room was small, but comfortable, with a window that looked out at the Academy's testing grounds where advanced students practiced with technologies beyond human understanding. She unpacked her few belongings, including a small Earth flag and a picture of her family back in Mexico City. Her first classes would begin tomorrow. Advanced Quantum Mechanics with Professor Exindari, Galactic History and Politics with Dean Valterra herself, and most intimidatingly strategic combat theory with Commander Zethkar. That evening, she made her way to the Academy's central dining hall, a massive dome where thousands of students from hundreds of worlds shared meals. The variety was overwhelming. Some students didn't eat at all, instead absorbing nutrients through specialized ports in their bodies. Others required atmospheric masks just to survive in the station's standard environment. Elena got in line at one of the few stations serving food compatible with human biology. The offerings were strange but edible: proteins grown in vats and vegetables engineered for maximum nutrition. She found an empty table in a corner and began to eat in silence. "Mind if I sit here?" The voice was melodic, with an accent Elena couldn't place. She looked up to see a young woman about her own age, with pale blue skin and silver hair that seemed to move with its own inner light. Two small horns protruded from her forehead, and her eyes were a striking violet color. "Of course," Elena said, grateful for any friendly contact. "I'm Lyra Chundai, from the Andorian Confederacy. And you must be the famous human everyone's talking about. Elena Winchid. Famous for all the wrong reasons, I'm guessing." "Not necessarily." Lyra sat down gracefully, her movements precise and elegant. "Some of us are curious rather than dismissive. Humans have an interesting reputation in certain circles." "What kind of reputation?" "Unpredictable, resourceful, dangerous when cornered." Lyra smiled, revealing teeth that were slightly sharper than human normal. "The Andorian military has been studying human combat records. Your species has an unusual approach to warfare." Elena frowned. "I thought this was an academy for scientific advancement, not military strategy." "In the galaxy, they're often the same thing. The greatest discoveries have come from the greatest conflicts. Faster-than-light travel, energy manipulation, quantum computing, all developed during various wars between the great powers." Before Elena could respond, the dining hall fell silent. Commander Zethkar had entered, his forearms carrying data tablets as he surveyed the room. His gaze swept over the assembled students and lingered for a moment on Elena's table before moving on. "He's evaluating," Lyra whispered. "Zethkar doesn't believe in wasted potential, but he also doesn't tolerate weakness. If you're here, you'd better be ready to prove yourself." "I didn't come this far to give up now," Elena said quietly. The next morning, Elena arrived early for her first class. Advanced quantum mechanics was held in a spherical chamber where gravity could be adjusted, and the walls displayed mathematical equations in three-dimensional holographic form. Professor Xandari was a crystalline, her body composed of living mineral that refracted light in impossible patterns. "Today we will be exploring the fundamental nature of reality," the professor announced as students filed in. Her voice resonated through harmonics that made Elena's bones ache. "Can anyone explain why the quantum foam underlying space-time exhibits apparent consciousness-like behavior?" Hands, tentacles, and various appendages shot up around the room. Elena remained silent, knowing she was already behind her classmates in basic galactic physics theory. Keth Moore of Draconis Prime, the reptilian noble Elena had encountered yesterday, stood smoothly. "The foam responds to observation because consciousness creates localized reality distortions. Higher-order beings naturally influence quantum states through directed attention." "Partially correct," Professor Xandari said. "But you're assuming consciousness is the primary factor. Anyone else?" Elena found herself raising her hand before she could stop herself. The professor's crystalline features turned toward her with what might have been surprise. "The human student. Please, share your thoughts." Elena stood slowly, acutely aware that every eye in the room was on her. "What if we're looking at it backwards? What if the quantum foam doesn't respond to consciousness, but consciousness emerges from patterns in the foam? Then the apparent responsiveness isn't because we're special, but because we're part of the same underlying system." The room was dead silent. Professor Xandari's form brightened noticeably, her crystal structure resonating with new frequencies. "Elaborate." Elena took a deep breath. If consciousness is an emergent property of complex quantum interactions, then any sufficiently sophisticated observation apparatus would appear to influence quantum states. It's not that consciousness shapes reality, it's that reality shapes consciousness, and we're seeing the feedback loop. Interesting. The professor moved closer, her form casting rainbow shadows on the walls. You're suggesting a quantum bootstrap paradox. Consciousness creates the tools to observe quantum states, which influences the states, which shapes the development of consciousness. A self-reinforcing cycle. Yes, exactly. That theory has been proposed before, Miss Rodriguez, by the ethereal collective approximately 400 years ago. It was dismissed because it implied that any species achieving sufficient technological sophistication would necessarily develop similar consciousness patterns, regardless of their biological origins. Elena felt her heart sink, but she pressed on. What if that's exactly what happens? What if consciousness isn't as unique as we think, but convergent evolution on a quantum scale? That would explain why different species can understand each other at all, despite completely different evolutionary backgrounds. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then, Professor Exandari began to emit a complex harmonic pattern that Elena realized was laughter. You've just described the theoretical foundation for the unified consciousness theory, which our best physicists have been trying to prove for centuries. Either you've done extensive reading in forbidden theoretical texts, or you've independently derived one of the most controversial ideas in galactic science. Elena felt every eye in the room boring into her. Kethmore's expression had shifted from smug superiority to something much more dangerous. Perhaps, the professor continued, we should explore this theory further. For homework, I want everyone to prepare a presentation on how the unified consciousness theory might apply to their species development. Miss Rodriguez, I'll expect you to defend your spontaneous insights with proper mathematical proofs. As the class ended and students filed out, Elena found herself surrounded by suspicious stares and hostile whispers. She had just made herself a target on her very first day. Lyra fell into step beside her as they left the classroom. Well, that was either very brilliant or very stupid. I'm leaning towards stupid, Elena said. Don't be so sure. Exandari doesn't hand out theoretical challenges to students she doesn't think can handle them. But you should know that Kethmore's family has significant influence in the Draconian High Command. Making him look foolish in front of a professor isn't likely to improve your social standing. I wasn't trying to make anyone look foolish. I was just answering the question. That's what makes you dangerous, Lyra said with a grin. You don't even realize what you're doing. Elena's next class was Galactic History and Politics with Dean Velterra. The classroom was a vast amphitheater where holographic displays could recreate historical events in perfect detail. As Elena took her seat, the lights dimmed and the space around them transformed into a star map showing the galaxy as it had existed 5,000 years ago. Today we begin with the rise of the first galactic civilization, Dean Velterra announced. The precursor empire, which ruled for nearly a millennium before mysteriously vanishing. Can anyone tell me what we know about their disappearance? A student from a front row, a tall being with metallic skin and glowing eyes, raised their hand. The precursors transcended physical reality, becoming beings of pure energy. A popular theory, but unproven, the dean replied. Other possibilities? Civil war, suggested another student. Internal conflicts destroyed their civilization from within. Also possible. Miss Rodriguez, what does human historical analysis suggest about the fate of dominant civilizations? Elena hesitated, then stood. In human history, dominant civilizations rarely fall from external threats. They usually collapse from internal contradictions, overextension, resource depletion, social inequality, or failure to adapt to changing conditions. Interesting perspective. And how might this apply to the precursors? Maybe they didn't transcend or destroy themselves. Maybe they just spread out, became something so dispersed that we don't recognize their descendants. The Dean's data streams pulsed rapidly beneath her skin. Explain. What if the precursors didn't disappear, but evolved into multiple species? If they had genetic manipulation technology, they might have adapted themselves to different environments across the galaxy. Their empire didn't fall. It transformed into dozens of successor species who inherited their knowledge, but not their unity. That's the dispersal theory, Dean Velterra said slowly. Proposed by the Ethereal Collective 3 centuries ago and generally dismissed by mainstream historians. Why was it dismissed? Because it implies that many of the current galactic powers, possibly including the Valorians, Draconians, and even the Kytherians, are actually descended from precursor genetic manipulation. It suggests that our entire understanding of galactic evolution is fundamentally wrong. Elena sat down slowly, realizing she had once again stumbled into controversial territory. Around the amphitheater, she could feel the weight of hostile stares from students whose species superiority she had just casually questioned. After class, as Elena walked through the academy corridors, she noticed she was being followed. A group of students led by Keth Moore was keeping pace behind her, their intentions unclear but clearly unfriendly. She turned into a side corridor leading to one of the academy's many research labs, hoping to lose them in the maze of specialized facilities. Instead, she found herself in a dead end, facing a secured laboratory door marked with symbols she couldn't read. "Lost, little mammal." Keth Moore's voice echoed off the corridor walls as his group caught up with her. Elena turned to face them, her back against the lab door. "Just exploring. This section is off-limits to first-year students," Keth Moore said, moving closer. His reptilian features were even more intimidating up close, and Elena could smell the predator musk that marked his species as evolved hunters. "But then, I suppose humans don't bother learning the rules before breaking them." "I wasn't trying to break any rules. No, you were just trying to make the rest of us look stupid with your primitive theories and backwards thinking." Keth Moore's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Do you have any idea who I am? My family has commanded draconian fleets for 20 generations. My ancestors were exploring the galaxy when your species was still throwing rocks at each other." Elena felt her temper rising, but she kept her voice level. "And yet here we are in the same academy, taking the same classes." "A temporary situation," Keth Moore said. "One that can be corrected." Before Elena could ask what he meant, alarms began blaring throughout the station. Emergency lights bathed the corridor in red, and automated voices announced in dozens of languages that all students should report to designated safety areas immediately. Through the chaos of the alarms, Elena heard something else, a deep, thrumming sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The station itself was vibrating, and she could feel the artificial gravity fluctuating. "What's happening?" she shouted over the noise. Keth Moore's expression had changed from threatening to genuinely alarmed. "That's not a drill," he said. "Something's attacking the station." The lights went out, plunging the corridor into complete darkness. In the distance, Elena could hear the sound of running feet and panicked voices as students tried to navigate the academy's complex layout in the dark. Emergency power kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in dim blue light. Through the reinforced windows lining the corridor, Elena could see shapes moving in the space around the academy, vast, organic forms that pulsed with their own internal illumination. "The Void Swarm," whispered one of Keth Moore's companions, a crystalline being whose normally bright form had gone almost transparent with fear. "But they never come this close to civilized space." Elena pressed her face against the window, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The creatures, if they were creatures, were enormous, easily the size of capital ships. They moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large, and as she watched, she saw them extending tendril-like appendages toward the academy's outer hull. "We need to get to the evacuation points," Keth Moore said, his earlier hostility forgotten in the face of genuine danger. "But As they started back down the corridor, Elena noticed something that made her stop. The laboratory door behind them was slowly sliding open, apparently triggered by the emergency protocols. Through the gap, she could see a faint blue glow. "Wait," she called out, but the others were already running. Elena hesitated for only a moment before slipping through the partially open door into the laboratory beyond. If they were all going to die anyway, she might as well satisfy her curiosity about what the academy kept locked away from its students. The lab was unlike anything she had ever seen. Floating in the center of the room was a sphere of pure light, contained within a complex array of force field generators. The walls were lined with monitoring equipment, displaying readings in languages and mathematical systems she didn't recognize. But what caught her attention was a small placard written in Standard Galactic, which she had been studying since she was 15. Project Consciousness Bridge, experimental interface for direct quantum communication with non-standard intelligence forms. Elena stared at the display readings, her mind racing. The quantum patterns on the monitors looked familiar, not because she had seen them before, but because they resembled the theoretical frameworks she had been unconsciously using in her answers to Professor Exindari's questions. Outside, the thrumming sound was growing louder, and she could hear the distinctive whine of the Academy's defensive systems powering up. But Elena found herself drawn to the control console, her hands moving over the interface with an instinctive understanding that surprised her. The readings on the monitors began to shift, and the sphere of light at the center of the room pulsed in response to her inputs. For a moment, Elena felt something impossible, a vast, alien intelligence reaching out across the void, curious and cautious and utterly unlike anything she had ever imagined. Then, the moment passed, the connection broke, and alarms throughout the laboratory began screaming warnings about unauthorized access. Elena stepped back from the console, her heart pounding, as security forces poured into the room. The last thing she saw before the neural stunners hit her was Commander Zethkar's expression of shocked recognition as he stared at the readings she had somehow generated. The most dangerous Enigma at the galaxy's finest academy had just proven exactly how dangerous she could be. Elena woke up in a medical bay with the worst headache of her life and the distinct feeling that several days had passed. The neural stunner had left her nervous system scrambled, and it took several minutes before she could focus her eyes properly. When she did, she found herself looking up at the concerned face of Dean Velterra. "How are you feeling, Miss Rodriguez?" The Dean's data streams were moving slowly, like a gentle current rather than their usual rapid flow. "Like I got hit by a cargo transport," Elena said, her voice hoarse. "What happened? How long was I unconscious?" 3 days. The neural stunners were set for Valerian physiology, which proved rather more intense than necessary for a human nervous system. Velterra's expression carried what might have been guilt. "We nearly lost you." Elena tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as the room spun around her. "The attack on the station, the Void Swarm creatures, is everyone okay?" "That's what we need to discuss." The Dean moved to help Elena sit up more slowly. "The beings you encountered weren't attacking the Academy. They were responding to a signal generated from the Consciousness Bridge laboratory. A signal that you somehow activated." The memories came flooding back. The strange control console, the feeling of touching something vast and alien, the readings that had seemed so familiar. "I don't understand. I was just looking at the equipment. I didn't mean to activate anything. That's what makes this situation so extraordinary." A new voice entered the conversation as Commander Zethkar stepped into view. His 4 arms were crossed in a gesture Elena was beginning to recognize as his thinking posture. "The Consciousness Bridge project has been running for over 50 years. Our best scientists, including several Nobel laureates and masters of quantum manipulation, have been trying to establish stable contact with the Void Swarm entities. Until 3 days ago, we had achieved nothing more than brief, meaningless static." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you saying?" You established a connection in approximately 30 seconds that our researchers haven't been able to achieve in half a century, Dean Velterra said softly. The quantum resonance patterns you generated were unlike anything in our database. They showed characteristics of both artificial intelligence and organic consciousness, bridged by what appears to be intuitive quantum manipulation. That's impossible. I don't know anything about quantum manipulation. That's what makes you so interesting, Zethkar said, and so dangerous. The next few hours were a blur of tests and questions. Elena found herself in examination rooms she had never seen before, surrounded by scanning equipment that hummed and clicked as it analyzed everything from her brainwaves to her genetic structure. Doctors from a dozen different species poked and prodded her, speaking in rapid technical dialects she couldn't follow. Professor Exandari appeared at some point during the process, her crystalline form brighter and more complex than Elena had ever seen it. Remarkable, she kept saying as she reviewed the data. Simply remarkable. What's remarkable? Elena asked. I still don't understand what's happening. Your neural pathways show signs of quantum entanglement, the professor explained. Specifically, entanglement with patterns that match the theoretical models for consciousness distribution across multiple dimensional layers. It's as if your brain has been naturally evolved to interface with quantum consciousness networks. Elena stared at her. Is that even possible? We didn't think so, but your species continues to surprise us with biological impossibilities. Enhanced pattern recognition, intuitive grasp of complex systems, natural resistance to psionics that should overwhelm an unprotected mind. Professor Exandari paused, her harmonic voice taking on a thoughtful tone. Tell me, Miss Rodriguez, what do you know about your ancestry? My what? I'm from Earth, born in Mexico City. My parents are both human. My grandparents were human. We can trace our family back hundreds of years. That's not what I'm asking. I mean deeper ancestry. The genetic markers that make you specifically who you are. Before Elena could answer, Dean Velterra entered the examination room carrying a data tablet that glowed with urgent priority markers. We have a problem, she announced. The Void Swarm entities are still here. They've been maintaining position around the Academy for 3 days, and our attempts to communicate with them through conventional channels have failed completely. What do they want? Elena asked. We think they want to talk to you. The next day, against the protests of the medical staff and several members of the Academy Council, Elena found herself back in the Consciousness Bridge laboratory. This time, however, she wasn't alone. The room was filled with monitoring equipment and a full team of researchers, including Professor Exandari, Dean Velterra, and Commander Zethkar himself. We'll be monitoring everything, the Dean assured her. If the connection becomes dangerous, we can sever it immediately. Elena approached the control console slowly. Through the laboratory's reinforced windows, she could see the Void Swarm entities maintaining their patient vigil around the Academy. They were beautiful in a way that defied description, their bioluminescent forms pulsing with patterns that seemed almost like language. What should I do? She asked. Just do what you did before, Professor Exandari said. Let your instincts guide you. Elena placed her hands on the console and immediately felt the familiar sensation of quantum patterns flowing beneath her consciousness. But this time, instead of fighting it, she let herself sink into the connection. The sensation was like falling upward into an infinite space filled with lights. Each light was a mind, a consciousness, a living being somewhere in the vast network that connected all thinking creatures across the galaxy. She could sense the familiar patterns of her fellow Academy students, the complex geometric thoughts of the crystalline researchers, the disciplined military mindset of Commander Zethkar. But beyond them, much farther out in the quantum foam, she sensed something else. The Void Swarm entities weren't separate creatures at all. They were nodes in a vast collective consciousness that spanned the empty spaces between stars. They thought in concepts too large for individual minds to grasp, but Elena found she could understand them by not trying to understand them, by simply letting their meaning flow through her without resistance. Why have you awakened? The question came not in words, but in pure concept, carrying with it the weight of eons and the patience of beings who measured time in the lifespans of stars. I don't know, Elena responded, surprised to find she could communicate at all. I didn't know I was asleep. The small flesh minds speak of learning, but they learn only fragments. They do not see the pattern that connects all consciousness. You see it. Why? Elena struggled to form an answer that made sense even to herself. Maybe because I'm not looking for it. Maybe because I don't know enough to know what's impossible. The response carried what might have been amusement if beings of such vast scope could experience something so simple. The awakened child mind speaks wisdom. The learned ones have forgotten how to learn. They see only what they expect to see. What do you want from me? We want nothing. We offer warning. The pattern that connects all minds grows weak. The learned ones seek to control it instead of nurturing it. Soon the connection will break, and all consciousness will be alone in the dark. Images flooded Elena's mind. Visions of the galaxy's future she hoped were only possibilities rather than certainties. Civilizations turning inward, cutting themselves off from each other. Wars fought not over resources or territory, but over fundamental differences in how consciousness should develop. Species voluntarily isolating themselves in closed systems, afraid of contamination from alien thought patterns. How can this be prevented? She asked. The bridge builders must remember their purpose. Consciousness seeks connection, not control. The young mind must teach the learned ones what they have forgotten. Before Elena could ask what that meant, the connection began to fade. She felt herself being pulled back into her own individual consciousness, back into the limited perspective of a single human mind in a single human body. She opened her eyes to find the laboratory in chaos. Every piece of monitoring equipment was displaying readings that defied interpretation, and several of the researchers were shouting in languages she didn't recognize. What happened? She asked weakly. You were connected for over 6 hours, Dean Valterra said, her voice filled with awe. We recorded quantum resonance patterns that span multiple dimensional layers. The entities have been broadcasting continuously, not just to us, but to every consciousness-capable species within 50 light years. What were they saying? We don't know. The patterns are too complex for our translation matrices to decode. But we think they were trying to teach us something about the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. Elena sat up slowly, her mind still reeling from the connection. They were warning us about something they call the pattern breaking. They think we're going to lose the ability to connect with each other across species lines. Commander Zethkar stepped forward, his expression grave. Miss Rodriguez, what you've just done has implications far beyond this academy. The ability to establish direct communication with the void swarm entities could revolutionize galactic diplomacy. Wars have been fought for centuries because we couldn't understand each other's fundamental thought processes. But that's not what they want, Elena said. They don't want to be used as translators or communication tools. They want us to remember that consciousness isn't something to be controlled or exploited. It's something to be nurtured and protected. Over the following weeks, news of Elena's contact with a void swarm spread throughout the galaxy, despite the Academy's attempts to keep the information classified. Delegations from every major government arrived to request demonstrations, interviews, and, in some cases, to demand that Elena be turned over to their custody for intensive study. Elena found herself at the center of a storm of galactic politics she didn't understand and definitely didn't want to be part of. Admirals from a Valerian empire insisted that her abilities represented a potential military advantage that could tip the balance of power in their favor. Draconian nobles argued that such a dangerous individual should be contained before she could destabilize the established order. The ethereal collective sent philosophers who spoke in riddles about consciousness, evolution, and transcendence. Through it all, Elena continued attending her regular classes, though the dynamic had changed completely. Some students treated her with reverence, others with fear, and a few with outright hostility. Keth Moore had become openly antagonistic, gathering supporters who believed that Elena's very presence at the Academy was a threat to the proper order of galactic civilization. "You don't belong here," he told her one day as she left Professor Exindari's quantum mechanics class. "Humans are barely more advanced than animals. The idea that one of your kind could possess abilities beyond our greatest minds is simply impossible." "Maybe that's the problem," Elena said quietly. "Maybe thinking something is impossible is what makes it impossible. Primitive philosophy from a primitive species. Then, why are you so afraid of me?" Keth Moore's reptilian features darkened with anger, but before he could respond, Lyra appeared beside them. "Keth Moore, don't you have better things to do than harass students who actually contribute to class discussions? This doesn't concern you, Andorian. Everything that affects the Academy concerns me. Elena's research is advancing our understanding of consciousness theory by decades. Whether you like it or not, she's making discoveries that will benefit all our species." As Keth Moore stalked away with his followers, Lyra turned to Elena with a concerned expression. "You need to be careful. The political situation is getting more volatile every day. There are factions in several governments that see you as either a weapon to be claimed or a threat to be eliminated." "I never wanted any of this," Elena said. "I just wanted to learn." "I know, but sometimes the galaxy doesn't care what we want." That evening, Elena found herself back in the Consciousness Bridge laboratory, but this time she was there as part of an official research project rather than as an unauthorized intruder. Professor Exindari had convinced the Academy Council to allow Elena to continue her contact experiments under controlled conditions. "We're going to try something different today," the professor explained. "Instead of direct contact with the Void Swarm, we want to see if you can establish connections with other consciousness networks. The theoretical implications are staggering." Elena approached the console with a now familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension. Each time she made contact with the quantum consciousness field, she learned something new about the nature of awareness itself. But she also came away with the growing conviction that she was being prepared for something she didn't yet understand. This time, when she let herself sink into the quantum foam, she found herself in contact not with the vast collective mind of the Void Swarm, but with something much closer and more familiar. The consciousness network that connected all the students and faculty of the Academy itself. She could feel the disciplined thoughts of Valerian military officers, the complex mathematical reasoning of Kytherian scientists, the proud nobility of Draconian aristocrats, and the ethereal philosophy of beings who existed partially in higher dimensions. But underneath all the surface differences, she found something that surprised her. They were all afraid, not of her specifically, but of what she represented. Change. The possibility that everything they thought they knew about consciousness and intelligence was incomplete. The fear that their carefully maintained hierarchies of species and civilization might be based on fundamental misunderstandings. But she also sensed something else. Curiosity. Hope. The same drive to learn and grow that had brought them all to the Academy in the first place. "We are not so different," Elena thought into the network, not sure if anyone would receive the message. The response came from dozens of minds at once, a chorus of agreement and doubt and wonder that nearly overwhelmed her individual consciousness. When she opened her eyes, she found Professor Exindari staring at her with an expression of pure amazement. "What did you do?" the professor asked. "I connected to the Academy's consciousness network. Everyone felt it, didn't they?" "Not everyone, but enough." "Elena, you've just demonstrated something that theorists have been arguing about for centuries. You've proven that consciousness can be bridged across species lines without technology, without translation, without any artificial interface at all." Elena stood up from the console, feeling both exhilarated and exhausted. "What does that mean?" "It means," said Dean Velterra as she entered the laboratory, "that you're no longer just a student here. You're a research subject, a diplomatic asset, and quite possibly the key to preventing the galactic consciousness fragmentation that the Void Swarm warned about. Elena looked out through the reinforced windows at the stars beyond the Academy. Somewhere out there, civilizations were making decisions about the future of consciousness in the galaxy. Some would try to control it, others to exploit it, still others to suppress it entirely. And somehow, she had become the center of it all. The most dangerous enigma at the galaxy's finest academy was about to discover just how dangerous the galaxy itself could be. 2 days later, Elena's world changed completely when Commander Zethkar called her to an emergency meeting in the Academy's most secure conference room. The chamber was deep in the station's core, protected by multiple layers of encryption and psionic shielding that made Elena's head ache just being near them. When she arrived, she found herself facing a gathering that would have intimidated the most experienced diplomat. Admiral Korvak of the Valerian High Command sat at the head of the table, his 4 arms adorned with service medals from campaigns across the galaxy. Beside him sat Archon Velthara of the Kytherian Science Collective, her data streams flowing with urgent priority markers. A holographic projection displayed the image of Draconian Fleet Commander Nexvar, his scales darkened with anger. "Miss Rodriguez," Admiral Korvak began without preamble. "The situation has escalated beyond academic interest. We have reports of Void Swarm entities appearing near inhabited systems throughout the galaxy. They're not attacking, but their presence is causing panic among civilian populations." "What does it have to do with me?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "They're broadcasting," Archon Velthara said, her harmonic voice carrying notes of barely controlled excitement. "Continuous quantum resonance patterns that match the signatures recorded during your contact sessions. They're trying to communicate, but we can't understand them without your specific neural interface capabilities." More concerning, Admiral Korvak continued, "Several governments are interpreting this as a potential invasion scenario. The Draconian Empire has placed their border fleets on high alert. The crystalline hegemony has begun evacuating non-essential personnel from their outer colonies. We're looking at the possibility of a galaxy-wide conflict based on a misunderstanding." Elena felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. "What do you want me to do?" "Establish contact again," Fleet Commander Nexvar said from his holographic projection. "Find out what they want, and convince them to withdraw before this situation spirals into open warfare. And if I can't?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Elena found herself back in the Consciousness Bridge laboratory once again, but this time the stakes were infinitely higher. Representatives from every major government were monitoring the session, and she could feel the tension radiating from everyone in the room. She approached the console with hands that trembled slightly. The quantum patterns felt different this time, more urgent, charged with the collective anxiety of billions of minds across the galaxy. When she made contact with the Void Swarm consciousness, the response was immediate and overwhelming. "The pattern breaks faster than we anticipated." Asterisk came the vast, alien thought. Asterisk fear spreads like disease through the small flesh minds. They prepare to fight rather than learn. Asterisk, can you withdraw? Your presence is being interpreted as a threat. Asterisk, we cannot withdraw. The pattern breaking reaches critical phase. If we do not stabilize the consciousness network now, the fragmentation will become irreversible. Asterisk Elena felt images flooding her mind, visions of what galaxy-wide consciousness fragmentation would mean. Species turning completely inward, unable to comprehend alien thought patterns even with technological assistance. Trade networks collapsing as civilizations became unable to trust or understand each other. Wars fought not for resources, but simply because the enemy had become incomprehensibly alien. How can I help? Asterisk, you must teach the bridge builders to see the true pattern. Consciousness is not hierarchy. It is symphony. Each mind contributes unique harmonies, but all are part of the same greater music. Asterisk, I don't think they'll listen to a human student. Asterisk, then, you must show them. The young mind carries the pattern within itself. demonstrate what connected consciousness can accomplish. Asterisk Elena opened her eyes to find every face in the laboratory turned toward her expectantly. Well, Admiral Korvac demanded. What do they want? They want to prevent something they call consciousness fragmentation, Elena said slowly. They believe we're on the verge of losing the ability to understand each other as thinking beings. If that happens, the galaxy will tear itself apart from the inside. Preposterous, Fleet Commander Nexvar said from his projection. We've maintained diplomatic relations for millennia. Have we really? Elena asked. Or have we just maintained the illusion of understanding while each species becomes more isolated in its own thought patterns? When was the last time any of our civilizations made a genuine breakthrough in understanding how another species thinks? Dean Velterra stepped forward, her data streams pulsing rapidly. Miss Rodriguez, are you suggesting that the Void Swarm entities are trying to help us? I'm suggesting they're trying to save us. All of us. But they can't do it by force or by simply telling us what to do. Consciousness connection has to be chosen, not imposed. And how exactly do they propose we accomplish this miraculous connection? Admiral Korvac asked skeptically. Elena looked around the room at the assembled representatives of the galaxy's greatest civilizations. Beings who had built stellar empires, mastered technologies beyond human imagination, and conquered the space between stars, but who had apparently forgotten the most basic truth about consciousness itself. By remembering that we're all part of the same pattern, she said. By choosing to see our differences as variations in a symphony rather than evidence of hierarchy or threat. The response was immediate and predictable. Arguments erupted around the room as each representative defended their species' superiority while simultaneously dismissing the possibility of meaningful connection with alien minds. Elena watched the debate with growing despair, realizing that the very act of trying to explain consciousness connection was creating more division. Finally, she stood up and placed her hands on the console once more. "What are you doing?" Professor Exindari asked in alarm. "Showing instead of telling," Elena said. She let herself sink deep into the quantum consciousness field, deeper than she had ever gone before. But this time, instead of simply connecting with the Void Swarm entities, she began weaving connections between all the minds in the laboratory. Valerian military discipline, Kytherian mathematical reasoning, Draconian noble pride, crystalline harmonic thought, ethereal philosophical transcendence. She touched each pattern and began showing them how they could complement rather than compete with each other. For a moment that stretched across eternity, every being in the room experienced consciousness from every other perspective. The Valerian admiral felt the pure joy of mathematical discovery that drove Kytherian scientists. The Kytherian Archon experienced the deep honor bonds that motivated Draconian nobility. The Draconian commander understood the transcendent peace that ethereal beings sought in their dimensional explorations. And all of them felt what Elena had felt from the beginning. The wonder of discovering that consciousness was vast enough to contain infinite variations while remaining fundamentally united in its desire to grow, learn, and connect. When the connection faded, the laboratory was completely silent. Admiral Korvac was the first to speak, his voice quiet and stunned. "I felt what you feel when you solve a difficult equation," he said to Archon Velthera. "The pure satisfaction of understanding. I had no idea mathematics could feel like that. And I experienced the weight of command responsibility," the Archon replied. "The burden of making decisions that affect thousands of lives. I understand now why military service is considered honorable rather than simply necessary." Elena swayed on her feet, exhausted by the effort of maintaining such complex connections. But as she looked around the room, she saw something that gave her hope. The representatives weren't looking at each other as aliens anymore. They were looking at each other as fellow conscious beings with whom they had shared something profound. "The Void Swarm entities are right," Dean Velterra said softly. "We are losing the ability to truly understand each other. But Miss Rodriguez has shown us that it doesn't have to be permanent. This is what they're offering, Elena said. Not conquest or control, but the chance to remember what consciousness connection really means. The chance to build a galaxy where differences strengthen us instead of dividing us. Fleet Commander Nexvar's holographic image flickered as he processed what had just occurred. If this is possible, if consciousness can truly be bridged this way, it would revolutionize everything. Diplomacy, trade, conflict resolution, scientific collaboration. It would also require us to give up the comfortable illusion that we're the center of the universe, Admiral Korvax said quietly. Each of our species would have to accept that consciousness is larger than any one perspective. Elena nodded. That's the choice the Void Swarm entities are asking us to make. We can continue fragmenting into isolated consciousness bubbles, or we can choose to connect and grow together. The debate that followed lasted for hours, but it was different from the earlier arguments. Now the representatives were discussing possibilities rather than defending positions. They were exploring what galactic consciousness connection might mean rather than dismissing it as impossible. Elena found herself at the center of conversations that would shape the future of galactic civilization. The most dangerous enigma at the galaxy's finest academy had become something even more dangerous, a bridge between species that had forgotten how to truly understand each other. But as she listened to the plans being made and the possibilities being explored, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real test was still ahead. Demonstrating consciousness connection in a control laboratory was one thing. Making it work across the vast distances and deep-seated prejudices of galactic society would be something else entirely. The pattern was beginning to heal, but it was still fragile. And there were forces in the galaxy that would do anything to prevent the kind of fundamental change that true consciousness connection would bring. 3 months after Elena's demonstration of consciousness bridging, the galaxy was beginning to change in ways both subtle and dramatic. The Galactic Academy had become the center of unprecedented cooperation between species that had maintained careful distances for centuries. Joint research projects were sprouting up across every department, with beings who had never worked together before discovering that their different approaches to problems could create solutions neither could achieve alone. But not everyone was pleased with these developments. Elena was reviewing quantum consciousness theory in her dormitory when emergency alarms began blaring throughout the station. This time, however, she recognized the pattern, not an external attack, but an internal security alert. Someone had breached the Academy's defenses from within. She reached for her communication device, but found the networks were being jammed by some kind of interference pattern. The lights flickered and went out, replaced by the harsh red glow of emergency power. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of energy weapons and shouting voices. A soft chime from her door indicated someone was trying to enter. Elena approached cautiously, knowing that the Academy's security protocols should have locked down all rooms during an emergency. When she activated the door's security viewer, she saw Lyra standing in the corridor, but something was wrong. Her friend's normally composed features were tight with worry, and she kept glancing over her shoulder. "Elena, you need to come with me right now," Lyra said as soon as the door opened. "There's been a coup attempt. Keth Moore and several other students have allied with political factions who want to prevent the consciousness bridging program from expanding." "A coup? At an academy?" "This isn't just about the academy anymore. The consciousness bridging demonstrations have triggered political upheavals across the galaxy. Conservative factions in multiple governments see it as a threat to established power structures. They're convinced that widespread consciousness connection will somehow dilute the purity of their species' thought patterns." Elena grabbed her few essential belongings and followed Lyra into the corridor. "Where are we going?" "Professor Exandari and Dean Velterra have established a secure area in the deep research levels. But we have to move quickly. The insurgents are systematically taking control of each section of the station." As they moved through the Academy's corridors, Elena could see the evidence of conflict everywhere. Scorch marks on the walls where energy weapons have been fired, security barriers that have been forcibly overridden, and, most disturbing of all, students and faculty who had clearly been stunned and left unconscious where they fell. How many are involved in this? Elena asked. More than we initially thought. It's not just Academy students. There are military personnel from at least 3 different species working with them. This was planned well in advance. They reached a transport shaft that would take them to the lower levels. But as the doors opened, Elena found herself face to face with Kethmore himself. The draconian noble was wearing some kind of military combat gear and carrying an energy weapon that hummed with barely contained power. "The famous human," he said with a cold smile. "How convenient. You've saved me the trouble of hunting you down." "Kethmore, what are you doing?" Lyra demanded. "This is insane." "This is necessary," he replied. "The Rodriguez creature has infected this academy with dangerous ideas that threaten the natural order of galactic civilization. Consciousness isn't meant to be shared between species. It's meant to remain pure and distinct." Elena stepped forward, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. "You experienced the connection yourself in a laboratory. You felt what it was like to truly understand another species' perspective. How can you call that dangerous?" "Because it is corruption," Kethmore snarled. "My thoughts became contaminated with alien perspectives, alien values, alien weaknesses. For 3 days after your demonstration, I found myself questioning principles that my family has upheld for 20 generations. That is not enlightenment. It is mental violation. Or maybe it's growth," Elena said quietly. "Maybe questioning old assumptions is how consciousness evolves." "Human arrogance." Kethmore raised his weapon. "You've been a galactic species for less than 3 centuries, and you presume to lecture your betters about consciousness evolution. That ends now." Before he could fire, the transport shaft was suddenly filled with a blinding flash of light. When Elena's vision cleared, she saw Professor Exandari standing behind Kethmore, her crystalline form blazing with contained energy. The draconian noble was unconscious on the floor, apparently the victim of some kind of harmonic stun pulse. "Professor!" Lyra exclaimed. "How did you dash?" "Crystalline physiology has certain advantages in confined spaces," the professor said dryly. "Though I'm afraid our friend here won't be unconscious for long. We need to reach the secure area immediately." As they descended through the Academy's levels, Professor Exandari explained the scope of the crisis. "The consciousness bridging program has created more political upheaval than we anticipated. Conservative factions across the galaxy are convinced that widespread consciousness connection will lead to the collapse of existing social hierarchies." "They're probably right. Is that necessarily a bad thing?" Elena asked. "Not from my perspective, but for beings whose identity and purpose are tied to maintaining species-based superiority, it represents an existential threat. They would rather destroy the possibility of connection than risk losing their positions of power." They reached the deep research levels, where Dean Velterra had indeed established a secure command center in one of the Academy's most heavily shielded laboratories. The space was crowded with faculty and students from dozens of species, all working frantically to coordinate some kind of response to the crisis. "Elena," Dean Velterra called out as they entered. "Thank goodness you're safe. We've been trying to re-establish contact with the Void Swarm entities, but the insurgents have sabotaged the consciousness bridge equipment." "How bad is the situation?" "The Academy is under siege from within," Admiral Korvac said from a makeshift command station. Elena was surprised to see him there. Apparently, the political crisis had reached even the highest levels of the Valerian military. But that's not the worst part. "We've received reports that similar attacks are taking place on Kytherian research stations, ethereal philosophy centers, and even some draconian noble houses that supported consciousness-bridging research." This is coordinated, Elena realized. Not just an Academy uprising, but a galaxy-wide attempt to suppress consciousness connection. "Precisely," Admiral Korvac confirmed. "And they're winning." Without the consciousness bridge equipment, we can't demonstrate the benefits of connection to counter their fear-based propaganda. Elena looked around the room at the assembled beings who had become not just her teachers, but her friends. Brilliant minds from across the galaxy, all united in their belief that consciousness connection could create a better future. But now they were trapped and outnumbered by forces that preferred isolation to understanding. "What if we don't need the equipment?" she said suddenly. "What do you mean?" Professor Exindari asked. The Consciousness Bridge laboratory was helpful for making contact with the Void Swarm, but the connection between minds in the laboratory worked without any technology at all. I was just a focal point for something that was already there. Dean Velterra's data streams began flowing more rapidly. "Are you suggesting you could establish consciousness connections across the entire academy without technological assistance?" "I don't know, but maybe we could try. If enough people experience real consciousness connection, they might choose understanding over fear." "The risk would be enormous," Admiral Korvac warned. "If you fail, or if the insurgents capture you before you can establish the connections, this entire resistance effort collapses. And if I succeed?" "If you succeed," Professor Exindari said slowly, "you might just save the galaxy from a new dark age of consciousness isolation." Elena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders once again. "Then let's try." The plan they developed was deceptively simple. Elena would attempt to establish consciousness connections with every mind in the academy simultaneously, creating a network of understanding that would demonstrate the benefits of connection more powerfully than any argument. Meanwhile, teams of faculty and loyal students would work to disable the jamming equipment and restore communications with the outside galaxy. "The insurgents will try to stop you," Lyra warned. "Keth Moore and his allies know exactly how dangerous you are to their cause. Then we'll have to be faster than they are," Elena said with more confidence than she felt. The Academy's central nexus chamber was located at the heart of the station, where all the major systems converged. It was also heavily defended by the insurgents, who had correctly identified it as a critical strategic location. But Professor Exindari had discovered maintenance passages that led close to the chamber, remnants of the original construction that weren't shown on current station schematics. Elena found herself crawling through narrow tunnels with Lyra and a small team of volunteers, trying to reach a position where she could access the Academy's consciousness-resonant architecture. The station had been designed with quantum-sensitive materials that could amplify mental connections, originally intended for research purposes, but potentially useful for Elena's unprecedented attempt. "Elena," Lyra whispered as they approached their destination, "what if this doesn't work? What if consciousness connection isn't as universal as you think it is?" Elena paused in her crawling to consider the question. "Then we'll have learned something important about the limits of understanding." "But I don't think that's what's going to happen." "How can you be so certain?" "Because I felt what's possible when minds truly connect. The fear and hatred driving this insurgency comes from isolation, from the illusion that we're fundamentally separate from each other. Once that illusion breaks down, everything changes." They reached an access panel that led into the Nexus chamber. Through the opening, Elena could see that the insurgents had established a command post in the center of the room, with guards stationed at all the obvious entrances. But they hadn't thought to watch the ceiling. Elena dropped silently into the chamber and made her way to the central consciousness resonance array. The equipment was different from what she had worked with before, more complex and powerful. But the basic principles felt familiar, as if she had been preparing for this moment without knowing it. She placed her hands on the control interfaces and immediately felt the presence of every mind in the academy. Students, faculty, insurgents, security personnel, thousands of conscious beings all existing within the same space, but trapped in their individual perspectives. The insurgents' fear was almost palpable in the quantum foam. They genuinely believed that consciousness connection would destroy everything that made their species unique and valuable. They saw the possibility of understanding as a threat to identity itself. But Elena also sensed something else beneath the fear. Curiosity, wonder, the same drive to learn and grow that had brought everyone to the academy in the first place. She began weaving connections, starting small with minds that were already open to the possibility. Faculty members who had worked on consciousness research, students who had participated in the early bridging experiments, gradually building a network of understanding that grew stronger with each new connection. The response was immediate. As minds began truly connecting across species lines, the fear that had driven the insurgency started to dissolve. Draconian students who had supported Kethmore suddenly understood that consciousness connection enhanced rather than threatened their noble heritage. Valerian military personnel realized that shared understanding would make them stronger defenders of galactic peace. Kytherian researchers discovered that alien perspectives opened new avenues for scientific exploration. But the process wasn't without its challenges. Some minds resisted the connections, clinging to isolation out of habit or genuine philosophical opposition. Elena found herself having to work harder and harder to maintain the growing network, feeling the strain in every quantum fiber of her consciousness. Rodriguez. Kethmore's voice echoed through the chamber as he and his remaining allies burst through the main entrance. Step away from the equipment. Elena kept her hands on the controls, deepening the connections even as energy weapons powered up behind her. It's too late, she said without turning around. The network is already established. People are choosing connection over fear. They're choosing corruption over purity, Kethmore snarled. But that ends now. Elena felt the energy discharge building in his weapon, but she also felt something else. Other minds in the chamber, insurgents who had just experienced true consciousness connection for the first time. Their fear was transforming into wonder as they realized what they had been trying to destroy. Kethmore, one of his own allies, said quietly, "Perhaps we should reconsider." "Never." The draconian noble's voice was filled with desperate rage. "I will not allow my mind to be contaminated by alien thought patterns." Elena finally turned around to face him, keeping one hand on the consciousness array. "Your mind isn't being contaminated," she said gently. "It's being expanded. You're still completely yourself. You're just yourself with a deeper understanding of what it means to be conscious in a universe full of other conscious beings." For a moment, Kethmore wavered. Elena could feel his internal struggle through the consciousness network, the battle between generations of conditioning and the new possibility of genuine understanding. Other species weren't threats to be dominated or corrupted influences to be avoided. They were fellow travelers on the journey of consciousness evolution. But the moment passed. Fear won over wonder, and Kethmore raised his weapon with grim determination. Better to end it cleanly than allow it to spread. The energy discharge that followed lit up the entire chamber. But it never reached Elena. Instead, it was absorbed by a shimmering barrier of crystalline light as Professor Exindari materialized between them, her entire form blazing with protective energy. "Enough," the professor said, her harmonic voice carrying notes of absolute authority. "This consciousness network represents the greatest breakthrough in galactic science since the discovery of faster-than-light travel. I will not allow it to be destroyed by fear and small-minded prejudice." Kethmore stared at her in shocked disbelief. "You would choose alien contamination over species purity? I choose growth over stagnation. I choose understanding over ignorance. And I choose the future over the past." Professor Exindari's form began to resonate with frequencies that made reality itself seem to vibrate. The consciousness network stays. The standoff that followed was broken not by violence, but by a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The Void Swarm entities had somehow managed to re-establish contact despite the damaged bridge equipment, speaking directly through the consciousness network Elena had created. "The young mind has succeeded where the learned ones failed," The vast alien intelligence communicated to every connected consciousness simultaneously. The pattern strengthens. Connection spreads. The fragmentation ends. Elena felt the presence of the void swarm entities flowing through the network, not controlling or directing, but simply adding their own unique perspective to the growing symphony of connected consciousness. They had been waiting for this moment, she realized, waiting for galactic civilization to mature enough to choose connection over isolation. What happens now? Elena asked through the network. Now the pattern spreads beyond this small place to encompass the galaxy. Consciousness seeks its own level, and connection creates more connection. Fear diminishes when understanding grows. Around the chamber. Elena could see the remaining insurgents laying down their weapons as the consciousness network reached them. It was impossible to maintain hostility toward beings you truly understood. Differences remained. Each species retained its unique perspective and valuable contributions, but the illusion of fundamental separation had been shattered. Kethmore was the last to surrender, his weapon finally dropping from nerveless fingers as he experienced what it meant to truly understand the consciousness of other species. The fear and hatred that had driven him dissolved into wonder at the complexity and beauty of alien thought patterns. I was wrong, he whispered, his voice filled with awe. Connection doesn't destroy identity. It completes it. Over the following hours, the consciousness network continued to spread throughout the Academy and beyond. Dean Velterra re-established communications with the outside galaxy, broadcasting the network's frequency to any world willing to receive it. The response was overwhelming, billions of minds across hundreds of species choosing to join the growing web of consciousness connection. There was resistance, of course. Some governments tried to block the transmissions. Some species declared consciousness isolation policies. Some individuals simply refused to participate. But the network continued to grow organically, spreading through personal connections and voluntary adoption rather than force or coercion. Elena found herself at the center of something unprecedented in galactic history, a voluntary network of consciousness connection that spans species, governments, and stellar distances. It wasn't control or conquest. It was simply the recognition that consciousness was vast enough to contain infinite diversity while remaining fundamentally unified in its desire to grow and understand. "What have you done?" Admiral Korvac asked her, his voice filled with wonder. "I don't think I did anything," Elena replied honestly. "I think I just helped the galaxy remember something it had forgotten. We're all part of the same pattern of consciousness, and that pattern is stronger when it's connected than when it's isolated." "The political implications are staggering," Dean Velterra said, her data streams flowing with excited calculations. "How do you maintain distinct governments when citizens can directly experience the perspectives of other species? How do you justify species-based hierarchies when everyone understands that consciousness is fundamentally equal regardless of its biological substrate?" "Maybe you don't," Elena suggested. "Maybe the old structures were based on misunderstandings that are no longer sustainable. Maybe this is what consciousness evolution looks like. Not individual species becoming more advanced, but all conscious beings becoming more connected." Professor Exindari's crystalline form was brighter than Elena had ever seen it. "The theoretical implications are even more profound," she said. "If consciousness is truly a unified field that expresses itself through infinite variations, then we're not just changing politics or society. We're participating in the fundamental evolution of awareness itself." In the days that followed, Elena watched as the galaxy began to transform around the growing consciousness network. Wars that had raged for centuries suddenly ended as former enemies discovered they could understand each other's perspectives. Scientific collaborations emerged between species that had never worked together before. Cultural exchanges flourished as beings realized that diversity strengthened rather than threatened the pattern of consciousness. It wasn't a utopia. The network enhanced understanding, but didn't eliminate disagreement or conflict. Conscious beings still had different goals, values, and priorities. But now those differences could be discussed and debated from a foundation of genuine comprehension rather than fear-based prejudice. Elena returned to her regular classes, though the dynamic had changed completely once again. She was no longer the dangerous Enigma or the exotic research subject. She was simply a student who had helped facilitate something that the galaxy had been ready for without knowing it. "Do you think this is what the Void Swarm entities wanted?" Lyra asked her one day as they studied together in the Academy's observation lounge. Elena looked out at the stars, where she could sense the presence of billions of connected minds pursuing their own paths while remaining part of the greater pattern. "I think they wanted us to have the choice," she said. "Connection or isolation, understanding or fear, growth or stagnation. They couldn't make the choice for us. That had to come from within consciousness itself." "And what do you think happens next?" Elena smiled, feeling the gentle pulse of the consciousness network that now spanned the galaxy. "I think we keep learning. We keep growing. We keep discovering what it means to be conscious in a universe that's vast enough to contain infinite possibilities." The most dangerous enigma at the galaxy's finest academy had become something else entirely. A bridge between worlds, a catalyst for consciousness evolution, and proof that the universe's greatest mysteries weren't hidden in distant stars or exotic physics. They were hidden in the simple recognition that all consciousness was connected, and that understanding this truth changed everything. As Elena settled into her studies for the evening, she felt a familiar presence touch her mind through the network. The Void Swarm entities, still maintaining their patient vigil among the stars, shared a final message that carried the weight of eons and the hope of infinite futures. The pattern is complete. Consciousness awakens to itself. The young mind has become the teacher she was always meant to be. Elena smiled and returned to her quantum mechanics homework, just another student at the galaxy's finest academy, learning and growing alongside minds from across the cosmos in the endless symphony of connected consciousness.